Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Lease Cake Live session. My name is Michelle Benjamin. I'm the Vice President of Marketing at Lease Cake. And today we're here to talk about understanding CAM charges. Such an exciting topic. CAM reconciliations are exciting. I don't know, are they exciting? Probably not. They're important. Before we get into the actual content, a few housekeeping items. I know there are some people who may have to leave early or have some other things on their mind given the storm that's happening, but we are recording this. I will be sending it out to you. You can listen again or share it with your colleagues if you would like to. And if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen and send that over. And we'll be keeping an eye on those, and we are saving time at the end for the Q&A. So don't be shy with your questions. We want to make sure everything is clear, and we'd love to answer your questions. So with that, I will introduce our lovely speakers. If I can get my mouse to work. Krista and Tina, there are two real estate managers here at Lease Cake. If you are a customer of ours, you may have met them before and worked with them. They do a lot of amazing real estate services here, but they are our CAM specialists. So welcome both of you, and I will pass it over to the two of you to let's get started with CAM.
Thank you, Michelle. So first we're going to start with what are CAM charges? Probably seems like a great place to begin. So common area maintenance charges, or CAM charges, they describe the expenses associated with maintaining spaces that tenants share in a commercial or a retail property. CAM may also be referred to as operating expenses. You'll see both terms used in your lease agreements, and they're often passed through to various tenants at the shopping center. It could be all of them. It could be partial. Your lease should explain further. These expenses, they may sound fairly straightforward. However, it can be one of the most misunderstood and disputed clauses in a lease. If your agreement is poorly written with a vague CAM clause, it may have one of the biggest unforeseen negative monetary impacts on you as a tenant. We're here today to help provide insight on a few things and draw your attention to some items that may cause challenges between a tenant and landlord when it comes to these CAM expenses. Next.
When calculating the common area expenses, the landlord will account for all costs associated with maintaining and operating the common areas of the property. These expenses generally include items such as the landscaping, cleaning, trash service, utilities, property management fees, security, repairs, and other common area costs. This list might seem comprehensive, but it's important to just think of the common area expenses as those shared expenses that provide an equal value to all the tenants. There may also be an administrative fee ranging anywhere from 5 to 15% of the total of all CAM. Ideally, your lease should detail expenses that are to be included and excluded from the CAM. And we're going to go into more detail on that later on in the presentation.
Pro-Rata Share. So to determine each tenant's pro-rata share of the CAM expenses, the landlord typically does use the following formula that you'll see on your screen, which is tenant's leasable area divided by total leasable area in the property. Tenant's leasable area is the square footage or the measurement of the tenant's lease space within the property. The total leasable area is in the property is the sum of all the leasable areas within the entire property. So all of your tenants in a shopping center, for instance, if you happen to be in a shopping center. Keeping in mind, however, that the CAM charges and the pro-rata share for each tenant, it's typically calculated using a formula specified in the lease. This is the one we see the most common. However, it could be calculated based on square footage as well. So keep that in mind. You'll want to refer to your lease agreement to be certain how your pro-rata share is to be calculated. Next slide.
So once the landlord has the pro-rata share calculated for each tenant, they'll then estimate the annual CAM charges. Those are all those expenses we talked about 2 slides ago, I think, like your landscaping, security, items like that. So they'll look at those total expenses, and it's going to equal your pro-rata share times your estimated CAM charges will equal your pro-rata share times your total CAM expenses. Some landlords will base the estimates on their budgets, which are usually finalized in the fourth quarter for the upcoming year. So you might receive a letter around November or December stating that effective January 1st, your new estimates will be X amount. Other landlords kind of let the reconciliation serve as the basis for revised estimate. So along with the reconciliation, there might be a statement of the new estimates. It's important to understand the effective date of the new estimates, as it may be effective the next full month after the statement is sent, or some landlords actually make the charges retroactive back to January 1st of that year. Also, if your reconciliation shows a significant underpayment or overpayment, yet your estimates have not been revised, it may be worth a discussion with your landlord so that the following year you don't have a repeat of the same drastic underpayment or overpayment.
CAM reconciliations. So at the end of the fiscal year or another specified reconciliation period, which will again be defined in your lease, the landlord reconciles the actual CAM expenses that they incurred during that period against the total of those CAM estimates that Tina mentioned paid by each tenant. If a tenant has overpaid their estimated CAM charges, they may receive a refund or a credit towards future CAM charges. Or if your lease provides support, your credit may also appear available to deduct from the next month's rent. You will want to pay close attention to your lease for this as well, because you may, if you do try to process a CAM credit against your base rent, you may be in default of your lease. So you may want to just double check before you take that credit if it's against future CAM or against future rents. And if a tenant has underpaid for the year, they may receive an additional adjustment bill for the additional amount owed, which that should be promptly paid per the terms of your lease to your landlord.
As we stated earlier, a poorly worded lease can have negative financial consequences. It's especially true when it comes to CAM clause because they can often be complex. In general, you want your lease to be comprehensive and avoid vague language that is open to interpretation. Beyond the generalities, we're now going to go into a few specific ways that you can tighten up your lease to ensure that you're paying your fair share of expenses.
So when it comes to included and excluded CAM costs, while your tenants and landlords may agree that CAM charges include direct costs for management, maintenance, and repair of the common areas, having both parties agree on what they should and should not charge, it can be a challenge. If a lease lacks clarity in defining what expenses are included in the CAM calculations and what expenses are specifically excluded, it leaves room for unexpected and or excessive CAM charges to be passed through to tenant. There is no clear industry standard definition of what particular CAM charges should be included. Therefore, tenants should carefully review the list of the CAM costs that the landlord is proposing to pass through and begin to negotiate some of those items. The following is a partial suggested list of ordinary CAM costs that a tenant should ask its landlord to exclude from your reconciliations. These include capital expenditures of any kind, or you can request that they amortize according to GAAP. They charge them in that fashion. Any costs related to maintenance, repair, or replacement of the structural component of the shopping center, you'll want those excluded. Expenses related to foundation issues. Any expenses related to repairs of the roof structure. Any ownership related costs, for example, costs that do not benefit the tenant, such as charges for depreciation, mortgage interest, debt service, or financing fees. You'll want legal fees, leasing commissions, and professional fees incurred by the landlord from negotiating other leases or resolving disputes other than, for example, if your landlord does work to get the real estate taxes reduced and they have an appeal fee, a lot of times your lease will support that for reimbursement to the landlord. Costs to the landlord for renovating, improving, decorating, or painting vacant spaces for other tenants. You'll definitely want that excluded. costs incurred by the negligence acts of the landlord, costs or expenses which are covered by insurance that the landlord is required to maintain. You will not want to be responsible for those. And lastly, any tenant-specific charges. Those should not be passed through to you. Next.
We spoke earlier about pro-rata share. And we want to go into more about how it's calculated. You want to be aware of how the language is written because it can increase your tenant's liability of costs by directly affecting the math and the subsequent outcome of its pro-rata share formula. In CAM charge calculation, GLA or gross leasable area and GLOA, gross lease occupied area, are terms used to describe different measurement methods for determining a tenant's proportionate share of CAM expenses. They're both related to the calculation of CAM charges, but are based on slightly different concepts. So the gross leasable area, or GLA, refers to the total square footage or area within a property that is available for lease to tenants. It includes all space that is intended for occupancy, both vacant and leased. When used in CAM calculations, a tenant's pro-rata share is typically based on their lease space as a percentage of the total GLA of the property. So for example, if a tenant leases 1,000 square feet in a property with a total GLA of 10,000 square feet, their proportionate share is going to be 10%, which is 1,000 square feet divided by the 10,000 square feet of the total property. Now, GLOA, or gross lease occupied area, refers to the total square footage or area within a property that is currently leased. It excludes any vacant or unleased space in the property. When used in CAM calculations, the pro-rata share is based on the leased space as a percentage of the total leased area of the property. This approach focuses solely on space that is generating rental income. So if we take that same 10,000 square foot building used in the example earlier and say only 8,000 square feet is actually leased, the same 1,000 square foot tenant, their proportionate share becomes 12.5%. And that's 1,000 square feet divided by the 8,000 square feet that's leased. Another way that a landlord offsets costs due to vacancy is through a gross up provision. This allows the landlord to increase expenses to what they would be if the property was nearly or fully occupied. If a gross up provision is used, the lease will stipulate the gross up factor, usually 95%, but could be 100%. So this is to say that they'll take those expenses and adjust them to what they would be if the property was 95 or 100% occupied. Some leases will use the language fully occupied, which means 100% gross up factor. Now be careful, as this should only apply to expenses that actually fluctuate based on occupancy. So by way of example, if there's shared trash service where all tenants use a common dumpster, those expenses are going to fluctuate based on occupancy because more tenants equals more usage equals increased frequency of pickups or possibly more containers. On the flip side, looking at parking lot lights, for example, they should ideally be on from dusk to dawn, regardless of how many tenants actually occupy the building. So that would not be an expense subject to a gross up because it doesn't fluctuate based on occupancy.
So there are a few ways for a tenant to have more control over not being surprised with CAM increases each year. These can include negotiating a cap or a limit on the amount of increase each year, or negotiating a fixed CAM charge with a set fixed annual increase. You can often avoid challenging and costly disputes between the tenant and the landlord regarding the intended interpretation of the lease language concerning CAM costs by negotiating an agreed upon amount for the first year's CAM costs and caps for future annual increases. Two specific lease language terms that are extremely important when setting a cap on annual increases can be non-cumulative and cumulative. So when it comes to a non-cumulative cap, a tenant will always want to strive for a non-cumulative cap first off. And this cap sets a maximum limit on the annual CAM expense increase, and it does not allow the landlord to recover any unused increases from previous years. For example, if the agreed upon non-cumulative cap is 5% on the annual increases, and the first year the landlord's actual expenses increased by 7%, could be due to a really tough winter and they spent an astronomical amount on snow removal, for example. So the tenant is only obligated to pay up to that 5% increase. So the 7% would be null and void. And in addition, if the following year, the landlord's actual expenses only increase 3%, then that's all the tenant is obligated to pay, is that 3%. So a non-cumulative cap sounds more realistic and more reasonable than a cumulative cap, which means that if a tenant's actual share of CAM costs increase in 1 year and it exceeds the cap, the excess of the unused amount, that'll roll over to future years. So using the non-cumulative example above that I just stated, the tenant would still pay only a 5% increase in year 1 because it's capped at 5%, although the landlord's expenses increased by 7%. But the following year, when the landlord's expenses increased by only 3%, the landlord would then be able to roll over that extra 2% from the prior year. So that year they would have another 5% cap, whereas if it was non-cumulative, they would only have had to pay a 5% and a 3% versus a 5% and a 5%. Hope that made sense. Caps can be very, they're one of the things that we find to be the most challenging, I will say, and disputed when it comes to reviewing reconciliations. So make sure that if you have cap language in your lease, that you understand it, your landlord understands it, and you both are on the same page with it.
In a fixed CAM structure, the monthly amount is a flat fee and is likely to increase at a fixed percentage rate annually over the lease term, no matter how much the landlord's expenses fluctuate year after year. So even if the landlord's expenses go down, you're still going to pay the stipulated increase. This method makes it easier for the tenant to budget and alleviates the time and expense of an audit. However, the downside is important to note. In some cases, the fixed CAM charge may be set too high, resulting in tenants paying more than their fair share of maintenance costs. Determining which method is better is a business decision, as you have to weigh the pro of knowing exactly what the CAM expenses will be from year to year against the con of potentially paying more. So if you're more budget conscious and you just want to know exactly what you're going to pay, then having a fixed CAM structure may be a better option.
Capital expenditures, or CapEx. These are major purchases made by a company that are used over a long period of time. Capital expenditure clauses in leases may refer to major repairs to the structure of the space or a costly utility system, for example. Lease language often includes clauses that address how capital expenditures are to be treated, and this language can vary from lease to lease. Here are some things to consider about capital expenditures in your lease language. Exclusion clauses. Some leases may exclude capital expenditures entirely or limit them to those that are required by law or produce documented energy savings as a result. Pass through. Some leases allow landlords to pass through the amortized cost of capital expenditures that, as a result, reduced operating costs to tenants. Tenant responsibility. Some leases may include a clause that states that the tenant is responsible solely for ongoing repairs and maintenance. You want to ensure that your lease clearly defines these items, however, because you don't want to get stuck with unexpected expenses that you thought may have been the landlord's responsibility. Negotiation. So tenants can negotiate to exclude some or all capital improvements. For example, tenants can negotiate to amortize expenditures that landlords insist on including in the payment of operating expenditures. You'll just want to be very careful when negotiating these clauses in your lease and make sure that it's very clear for both you and the landlord.
Management fees versus administrative fees. As we noted, some leases include an administrative fee, generally 15% of expenses. I feel like that's probably one of the more common ones that we say. In addition to that, the language may also permit the landlord to recapture management fees. This practice of charging both the management fee and admin fee may be viewed by unfair and double dipping. But most landlords do dig in their heels and state that there is a difference. If the landlord takes that stance, there are other ways to save. Include language fee that only permits management fee expenses paid to third parties and limits the amount that can be charged. You want to avoid vague lease language that states reasonable management fees. I feel that that's a very subjective term. Instead, you want to look for maybe putting a cap of 4% of revenue. Also avoid vague, all-encompassing lease language that states the landlord can recapture all expenses for the maintenance, operation, and management of the center, because the landlord can justify passing through a management fee if that language is in there. If the lease provides for both a management fee and an admin fee, try to negotiate the admin fee lower. If it's 15%, maybe try to negotiate it down to 5 or 10%, because again, you're paying it in addition to a management fee. And exclude the management fee from the calculation of the admin fee. Since the admin fee is a percentage of your CAM, and management fee is going to be included in the CAM, you want to try to carve that out. Also, and this one applies even if there's no management fee being charged, even if it's just a management fee, real estate taxes should be excluded from the calculation of the admin fee. Real estate taxes are one of the largest expenses associated with a building, but from an administrative standpoint, they're not very heavy or very difficult. So I just don't see justifying a 15% fee on that. So negotiate to have the real estate taxes excluded from the calculation of the admin fee.
So audit rights, I am very passionate about this topic. A tenant's lease should always include rights to review and audit the landlord's books and records to verify the validity of the CAM expenses charged. I believe this is something that all tenants should be entitled to do. You don't want to pay something that you're uncertain of. Keep in mind though that the audit clause will allow the tenant to uncover any overcharges by the landlord, potential errors or discrepancies in how its pro-rata share was calculated. This can arise from differences in interpreting the lease language, excuse me. Any number of errors or misinterpretations can be uncovered during this audit. Here are a few business points to consider when drafting the audit language. Once the tenant receives the landlord's end-of-year reconciliation of CAM charges reflecting any additional money owed, there's typically a limited time in which a tenant can request an audit to dispute any charges. You want to pay close attention to this window of opportunity because if it's too small, the tenant could miss the chance to review the landlord's books and records. For example, if the landlord only provides the tenant 30 days after receiving the year-end statement or the reconciliation to request an audit, then on that 31st day, if the tenant has not informed the landlord of its intent to audit, it's highly probable that the landlord will not allow the tenant to move forward with said audit, leaving the tenant with no further recourse. I'd always like to suggest that if you're reviewing a reconciliation within that 30 days and you're not sure if you're going to move forward with an audit, it can't hurt to just send that letter to the landlord or inform them via email, whatever your lease states, that you are intending on an audit. If you decide later you don't want to move forward with that audit, at least you have already protected your rights and you do have a right. I would beware of only having access to landlord's summary of charges versus their actual documents. Make sure your lease clearly defines what types of information that you can review. You'll want to confirm the true accuracy of these costs, and in order to do that, you'll want to have access to all of their invoices and other detailed documents relating to each specific CAM charge as needed. This is very important so that you can get a true review of those items that you may want to dispute.
Typically, tenants will pay the cost of an audit. The lease language may require that the landlord reimburse all or a portion of the cost of an audit if the expenses are overstated by a certain percentage, say maybe 5%. They can get expensive, especially if there's restrictive language in the lease. For example, language that requires the audit be performed by a CPA because CPAs rightfully require higher rates. Also, if the language only permits on-site audits, that will also increase the cost because travel is likely going to be involved. Some audit firms will provide service on a contingency fee basis, or they will only charge a percentage of any of the savings that they find. Just be careful of this though, as some leases do restrict audits based on a contingency fee.
So that wraps up a few of the points that we wanted to touch on today. It's important to note that the specific terms and formulas used for CAM calculations, they can vary from lease to lease. So tenants want to carefully review your lease agreements to understand how CAM charges are determined in your particular situation. Additionally, it's advisable for tenants to maintain clear communication with their landlords or property managers regarding CAM charges to avoid disputes and ensure some transparency in the reconciliation process. When in doubt on any lease language, don't ever hesitate to begin discussions with your landlord on possibly amending your lease to provide clarification for all parties involved. So with that, let's see if we have any questions, Tina. So this one's quite lengthy. Mia asked a pretty detailed question about a non-cumulative cap. I'd say first you want to refer to your lease. Your lease will always describe how the caps are supposed to be calculated and determined. But with non-cumulative, you're only paying, like I said, the percent, like if it was 5% increase, you would only pay the 5% cap. And then it's usually based on the prior year's actual expenses. There is no carryover or a maximum cap. That's more cumulative. So I just want to make sure I understood her question. I don't know if you have anything to add to that one, Tina.
No, I think you covered it very, very well. So the next question is, how does it work if LeaseKick handles the CAM reconciliation services for us? If we sign up for your service. LeaseKick service is meant to be a review and not a traditional audit. In fact, we kind of go out of our way to make sure that we don't negate any audit rights that you might have. What we're going to look at is we're going to look at the lease, read through the language, take a look at the proportionate share. Is it calculated correctly? Take a look at those caps. As Krista noted, that's one of the big ones. Is it being applied? Is it being applied correctly? Most landlords will give at least a general breakdown of expenses. So if there's anything on there that we note that doesn't align with the lease, like if we see a roof expense, a line item for a roof expense, and the lease specifically excludes roof repairs, we'll flag that. So those are the kinds of things we take a look at while still reserving your true audit rights. And we reply, let you know the things we flagged, so then you can go back to your landlord and kind of start that dialogue. Or if need be, then enforce your audit rights, where you or company you hire goes through each individual invoice, which is tedious, but sometimes necessary.
Yes. And sometimes your leases might say that you have to have a CPA do that audit review. So that's another thing you may want to review, just to know your audit rights and know what you can and cannot do during an audit. But we just do our high level review for those recon services to try to help you know what to dispute and what questions to ask.
I kind of like this question. Is it common to be able to negotiate CAM fees. From my experience, the lease says the tenant pays the CAM fees, and most of the time there is no room for dispute or negotiations. I think generally speaking, to negotiate whether or not you pay CAM, that's probably not negotiable. But as we kind of pointed out, what we want you to look at is kind of each of those components that you can start to negotiate to reduce your liability and your risk. Whether it be negotiate a more favorable cap structure, or negotiate those admin fees and management fees, negotiate some of those exclusions. So yes, likely you probably aren't going to be able to negotiate to not pay CAM, but you can at least try to negotiate to limit your CAM risk.
And if you are paying a fixed CAM, for instance, and maybe it was set, when the lease began, maybe those fixed CAM, maybe it needs to be adjusted. Maybe the base year needs to be adjusted. If there's a base year in your lease that you're paying over, it could be a really old base year. So there's different things, like Tina said, that you can do to adjust how your CAM is calculated. But yes, whether or not you do have to pay it or not, that's typically going to be one way or the other in the lease. But there are those little things within CAM that you can request to have adjusted. Can't hurt to ask.
It never hurts to ask.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. Thank you, Krista and Tina, so much. If you do have any other questions, we're going to be sending out the recording afterwards. So feel free to just reply to the email that I send out, and I can get the answers for you if you need them. If I need to rope in Tina or Krista, I will. But thank you both for sharing your insights.
Actually did have another question just come in. We still got time, right?
Yeah, for sure. Go ahead.
In your opinion, what expense is the one you find the most kind of cut off? I don't know if the person.
TJ Jester, is this the TJ I used to work with by chance? That's kind of funny. I noticed that name. Hi. It's so funny. Okay. But yes, do you have more to your question? Not sure. She might be typing. But yes, if you guys have any questions for Tina or I, we are happy to answer later. Oh, where we get savings. Yes, probably that cap. We do find a lot of savings with the CAM caps. A lot of landlords may not even apply those caps where the lease actually states they have to charge a cap. Tina and I are constantly going back to our clients and saying, hey, this doesn't look like they applied a cap at all. You might want to push back, or those. I've been finding some with that management and admin fees too. They do try to squeeze a lot of things in with that management fee expense. So that's one of those big ones.
Yes. And then I think this was a follow-up to the question on negotiating CAM. If you paid the landlord correct, if it's paid to the association directly. Yeah, associations do tend to be a little more rigid.
Yes.
So I would say you're probably, unfortunately, pretty accurate on that they're not gonna negotiate on it.
All right. Anything else going to pop up in the Q&A box?
Should we hang out for another couple minutes?
Give it a second. Just in case. Oh,
Oh.
there we go.
A vacancy. It depends on, that gross up could be stated in your lease, like Tina mentioned, right, Tina?
Yeah, that's where you're gonna want to pay attention to this thing, 2 items. If your pro rata share is calculated based on the GLA, the gross leasable area, or the GLOE, the gross leasable occupied area. If it says that it's based on the GLOA, or another way that they phrase it is gross leased area, meaning only those that are leased. Basically all the tenants are in a sense absorbing that vacancy because it's being factored in to their pro rata share calculation, or if there's a gross up provision. But again, when there's a gross up provision, they're really just taking the expenses, only those that fluctuate based on occupancy, and adjusting them to what they would be if the property was nearly full or completely full.
Right.
All right. Well, our next Lease Cake Live webinar session is in early November. I will include a link to it in the email that we'll send out the recording. It is actually going to be a demo of the Lease Cake lease management platform. So if you're not already a customer and you want to see it, we'll be doing a webinar walkthrough. So we can answer any questions about the actual product. But thank you both again so much for your expertise, and thank you everybody for joining us. And we will talk to you on the next time, and I hope you all have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.